The words echoed in Isolde's mind 3 weeks later, as frigid and sharp as the moment Duke Peregrine Blackwood had uttered them. She stood before the gilded floor-length mirror in her dressing room at Blackwood Manor, watching her lady's maid secure the final lace clasp at her wrist. The gown was a masterpiece, midnight blue velvet that contrasted starkly with her alabaster skin and cascading dark curls. Every inch of her reflection radiated the commanded power of a duchess. Every inch except the haunted vacancy in her own eyes. "Will that be all, Your Grace?" Isolde nodded, dismissing the girl with a brittle smile that failed to reach her gaze. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Silence flooded the room, suffocating and cold. Hey there, story lovers! Before we dive deeper into Isolde's plan for retribution, a quick welcome. If you're new here, hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep spinning these tales of love, regret, and redemption. My granny says if we hit 1,000 subs, she'll finally share her secret family romance stories from the old days. Don't make her wait. Drop in the comments where you're listening from. It helps us connect and share more epic stories like this one. She pressed a trembling palm against the cool glass of the mirror, scrutinizing the stranger staring back. Lady Isolde Fairmont, no, Blackwood now, daughter of a prestigious line, educated in history and philosophy, well-read in the struggles for women's independence, and trained in the quiet resilience her gender had required for centuries. She had been bred for this exact elevation, a duchess's consort. What she hadn't been bred for was the specific cruelty of a husband who viewed her not as a partner, but as a necessary inconvenience to be tolerated. "I require a successor. You require your family's debts settled. Let us not pretend this is passion." He had said that during their negotiation, a transaction, not a courtship. She told herself it was pragmatic, honorable even, better than the flowery lies most men spoke. But then came their wedding night. She had been nervous, naturally, but also foolishly hopeful. Surely a marriage of duty could spark respect. Surely intimacy could breed softness. She was wrong. Peregrine had come to her bed with the detachment of a man settling a debt, efficient, silent, and utterly devoid of warmth. And when the deed was done, when she lay there trying to reconcile the strange isolation that followed such closeness, he had stood, adjusted his robe, and delivered the sentence that now defined her existence. "Give me a son and vanish. That is all I ask of you." Then he had walked out, leaving her in the dark. She hadn't seen him alone since. Isolde turned from the mirror, smoothing her velvet skirts with hands that refused to shake any longer. Tonight was the Beaumont Gala, her debut into high society as the Duchess. Peregrine would be there, wearing the mask of the dutiful lord to silence the whispers about his past loves. And she would play the role of the perfect, untouchable wife. But what happens when a wounded heart turns steel? Will Isolde's subtle acts of independence crack the Duke's icy armor, or will his past shadows engulf them both? The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, the rhythmic clatter filling the suffocating silence between them. Isolde sat stiffly on the velvet squabs, her gaze fixed on the passing gaslights of London, though her mind was miles away, anchored in the humiliation of 3 weeks prior. Opposite her, Duke Peregrine Blackwood stared out the window, his profile etched in stone, as distant as a star and twice as cold. He had not spoken a word since helping her into the conveyance, his hand touching hers with the clinical necessity of a physician handling an instrument. It was exactly as the betrothal had been, a negotiation of assets rather than a union of souls. She remembered the solicitor's dry cough as he read the settlement, Peregrine's bored nod, and the utter absence of curiosity in his eyes when he finally looked at her. But the wedding night had severed whatever fragile hope she had nurtured. The memory of his back turning to her, the dismissal in his voice demanding a son before commanding her to vanish, still burned like acid in her throat. He wanted a ghost for a wife, a silent vessel to secure his legacy before retreating into the shadows. So she had resolved to give him exactly that, though not in the way he imagined. In the solitude of the last 3 weeks, Isolde had not wept. Instead, she had retreated to the vast ducal library, immersing herself in the histories of women who had been silenced by men of power, yet found ways to rule from the margins. She read of queens who turned their invisibility into armor, and noble women who wielded influence through intellect when their voices were stifled. These historical struggles fueled her resolve. If she was to be a broodmare in his eyes, she would be a queen in the eyes of everyone else. She would vanish into a persona of such impeccable perfection that her autonomy would grow unnoticed beneath the surface, a root system cracking the foundation of his indifference. Yet, as the carriage slowed near the Beaumont estate, the whispers she had heard among the staff returned to haunt her. They spoke of Lady Elowen Larkspur, the woman who had shattered the Duke's heart, and the brother whose memory lay between them like a festering wound. Peregrine's cruelty was not born of simple malice, but of a defensive fortification built against a past betrayal he could not forgive. He expected Isolde to be another deceitful beauty, another source of pain. The carriage halted. The footman threw open the door, letting in the cacophony of the gala, music, laughter, and judgment. Peregrine turned to her, his expression unreadable, and extended his arm. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice devoid of inflection. Isolde placed her gloved hand on his forearm, feeling the tension in his muscle. She raised her chin, the picture of the dutiful duchess, while inside her heart hammered a war drum. This was not just a ball, it was a battlefield. As she stepped down into the light, she wondered if her mask was strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of his past demons, or if the first polite inquiry would shatter her resolve and expose the trembling girl beneath. The Beaumont ballroom was a kaleidoscope of swirling silks, candlelight, and the hum of 100 whispered judgments. Isolde stepped into the fray not as a lamb to the slaughter, but as a queen claiming her court. She moved with a liquid grace, her midnight blue velvet catching the light as she navigated the crush of nobility. Where she expected scorn, she found curiosity. Where she expected dismissal, she commanded attention. She laughed at Lord Weatherby's dry wit and engaged the bishop in a surprisingly astute debate on moral philosophy, her intellect shining brighter than the diamonds at her throat. This was her uprising, silent, elegant, and undeniable. She was making herself essential to the very world Peregrine despised, ensuring that vanishing would soon be an impossibility. Peregrine watched her from the periphery, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. He had expected her to cower or cling to his side for protection. Instead, she was radiant. Yet as he tracked her movements, a cold knot tightened in his chest. Her charm was too practiced, her smile too dazzling. It struck a dissonant chord, unearthing memories of Elowen, whose laughter had been just as enchanting right before her betrayal shattered his family. Was this poise natural, or was Isolde merely another beautiful actress playing a part? The suspicion gnawed at him, warring with a grudging respect for how she held her head high despite the frost between them. The air around them shifted with the arrival of Lady Seraphina Voss. Draped in crimson and armed with a smile that was all teeth, Peregrine's former adversary glided toward them. "Duchess," Seraphina purred, her gaze raking over Isolde with a predatory assessment. "How lovely to finally see the woman who managed to drag our reclusive duke out of the shadows, and so quickly after the wedding. One might wonder if there was a reason for such haste." The implication hung heavy in the air, a subtle jab at the suddenness of the union, hinting at scandal or desperation. Peregrine stiffened, his instinct to defend clashing with his desire to remain aloof. But Isolde did not flinch. She met Seraphina's gaze with a serenity that was almost unnerving. "Haste is often confused with decisiveness, Lady Seraphina," Isolde replied, her voice smooth as glass. "The Duke and I saw no reason to delay a union that promises such a fruitful alliance. Why waste time with pageantry when there is work to be done?" Seraphina's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Work? I wasn't aware the position of a duchess required labor." "Perhaps not in your experience," Isolde countered softly, "but I intend to make the role count for more than just embroidery and gossip." Peregrine felt a shock of surprise ripple through him. She hadn't just deflected the blow, she had caught the arrow and snapped it. As Isolde turned back to the crowd, leaving Seraphina momentarily speechless, Peregrine realized with a jolt that his wife was not merely a piece of furniture he could discard. She was a force, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if his defenses were strong enough to keep her out. The parish hall smelled of damp stone and beeswax, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented air of Blackwood Manor. Yet to Isolde, it was the only place she could breathe. Standing before a dozen village women, their hands rough from labor, clutching slate pencils, she felt a purpose that transcended her title. "To read is not merely to understand words," she told them, her voice steady and warm. "It is to name your world, and a woman who can name her sorrow can eventually master it." This was the core of her initiative, arming these women not just with letters, but with the emotional resilience she was desperately trying to forge within herself. She returned to the manor flushed with the triumph of the afternoon, only to find the atmosphere thick with tension. Lady Seraphina's influence had seeped into the household like a draught. Whispers of the Duchess of Chalk and her quaint charity had reached the drawing rooms, painted as a desperate cry for attention by a neglected wife. Peregrine was waiting in the library, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his weary face. He did not look like the imperious tyrant of their wedding night. He looked haunted. "Seraphina claims you are embarrassing the family name with these lessons," he said, though his tone lacked the bite she expected. He stared into the flames, a glass of amber liquid loosely held in his hand. "She suggests it is a display of boredom." "It is a display of utility," Isolde countered, removing her gloves with deliberate slowness. "I promised to vanish, Your Grace. I did not promise to be idle. If my work offends you, I shall move it further from your sight." Peregrine turned then, his eyes dark and searching. "It does not offend me," he admitted, the words quiet, almost dragged from him. "It confuses me. Elowen, she consumed the world around her to fill her own emptiness. You seem intent on filling the emptiness of others." The mention of his former lover hung in the air, raw and exposed. For the first time, Isolde saw the grief beneath his armor, the devastating belief that all affection was a prelude to betrayal. He took a step toward her, his hand lifting halfway as if to touch her arm, a gesture of unconscious seeking. "I may have been precipitous in my judgment of what this marriage would be." For a heartbeat, the air crackled with a possibility that terrified her more than his coldness. She wanted to lean into that fraction of warmth, to offer the solace he clearly craved. But the memory of his command, "Give me a son and vanish," flashed like a warning beacon. To hope was to court destruction. Isolde stepped back, her face smoothing into a polite, impenetrable mask. "You were pragmatic, my lord, as was I." The moment shattered. Peregrine's hand dropped, his expression shuddering once more, and Isolde fled the room before he could see that her composure was nothing but a fragile lie. The rumor traveled faster than a carriage on a paved road, insidious and poisonous. Lady Seraphina had planted the seed with lethal precision, a whisper of a secret lover from Isolde's past, a phantom man to mirror Peregrine's own history of betrayal. By the time it reached Blackwood Manor, the lie had grown thorns. Peregrine found Isolde in her study, his face a mask of conflict. The old wounds from Elowin's deceit were torn open, bleeding fresh doubt into his eyes. "Is it true?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. He didn't want to believe it, yet his past conditioned him to expect the knife in his back. Isolde looked up from her ledger, her heart fracturing at his lack of faith. "You ask me to disprove a shadow, Peregrine. Rumors are like illiteracy. They thrive in the absence of knowledge, limiting the truth just as the inability to read limits a life. I am not her, and I am not a liar." He held her gaze, the silence stretching until it snapped. He turned on his heel and left, leaving Isolde trembling not with fear, but with indignation. Hours later, at the Lord Mayor's dinner, the tension was palpable. Seraphina held court, her eyes darting to Isolde with triumphant malice. But when a hush fell over the room, it was Peregrine who spoke. He stepped to Isolde's side, his hand firm upon her shoulder, a public claim of territory and trust. "My wife's integrity is the foundation of this house," he announced, his voice carrying a steely edge that silenced the whispers instantly. "Those who traffic in baseless falsehoods merely expose their own poverty of character." It was a victory, sharp and decisive, yet as they retreated to the privacy of their carriage, the air remained thin. Amid the turmoil, a chilling fear grips Isolde. What if unsubscribed hearts miss the redemption ahead? Don't let fear hold you back. Subscribe now without a second thought to witness the turnaround, or head to the comments and spill why you dare miss out on such transformative tales. The carriage swayed, and Isolde looked at her husband. He had defended her to the world, yes, but the memory of his earlier interrogation lingered between them. He had shielded her from the arrow only after checking to see if she deserved the wound. "You defended me," she whispered, her voice devoid of gratitude. "I defended the truth," Peregrine replied, staring straight ahead. Isolde turned to the window. His protection felt less like a bridge and more like a wall, impenetrable, impressive, and utterly cold. The frost at Blackwood Manor did not vanish in a single sunburst. Rather, it thawed drop by drop, dissolved by the warmth of shared suppers and the soft murmur of conversation that finally filled the dining hall. Peregrine began to seek her out not as a duty, but as a necessity, his gaze following her across the room with a hunger that had nothing to do with lineage and everything to do with the woman who had stood tall against his scrutiny. It culminated one rainy evening in the library. Peregrine stood by the hearth, the flickering light casting his sharp features in reliefs. "I looked for her betrayal in your face," he confessed, his voice rough with shame. "I was so certain that history was a circle, I nearly forced you to repeat it. I fortified my heart against a ghost and treated you as the haunting." Isolde set down her book, the distance between them closing not just physically, but spiritually. "Scars are not armor, Peregrine," she said softly, crossing the rug to take his hands. "I know this because my history books are filled with them. They are merely evidence of survival. But silence? Silence is where the infection grows. Just as my students cannot navigate the world without words, we cannot navigate this marriage without the courage to speak our hurts aloud." He looked at her then, his defenses crumbling completely, revealing the raw, terrified man beneath the title. "Teach me," he whispered, lifting her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent a jolt of lightning through her veins. "I am done with vanishing, Isolde. I want to be seen." Her pardon was not spoken, but granted in the way she stepped into his embrace, melting against the rigid lines of his body until they softened to match hers. That night, when he led her to his chambers, there was no clinical efficiency, no general dismissing a subordinate. The transaction was forgotten, replaced by a desperate, reverent discovery. He worshipped the curve of her throat and the strength of her hands, and when they finally came together, it was a searing declaration of presence. They were rewriting the narrative of their wedding night, turning a cold mandate into a passionate dialogue of skin and breath. Lying in the aftermath, his arm heavy and protective across her waist, Isolde felt the first true stirring of safety. They had built a sanctuary out of honesty, a fortress of trust that felt impregnable. But as the embers died in the grate and the shadows stretched long across the floor, a chill draft slipped through the window. The world outside had not forgotten them, and somewhere in the dark, Elowyn Larkspur was waiting, ready to test if this fragile, beautiful new love could withstand the weight of the past she still held in her hands. The benevolence recital was intended to be a triumph of art and charity, the air thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and the mournful swell of a cello. Yet, for Isolde, the evening curdled the moment Lady Elowyn Larkspur glided through the crowd during the intermission. Elowyn was a vision in emerald silk, a deliberate invocation of the past she shared with Peregrine, moving with the predatory confidence of a woman who believed she still held the leash to a man's heart. She intercepted them near the atrium, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Peregrine," she purred, ignoring Isolde entirely to fix her gaze on the Duke, "it is quaint to see you playing the role of the philanthropist. It reminds me of better days, before complications forced you into such domestic mediocrity." The insult was precise, designed to diminish Isolde to a mere footnote in Peregrine's grand tragedy. The surrounding circle of aristocrats quieted, their fans fluttering like nervous wings, waiting for the Duke to retreat into his customary icy silence. But Peregrine did not freeze. Instead, he shifted, placing his body deliberately between Elowyn and his wife, not as a shield, but as a barrier. He looked at Elowyn not with the torture of a lover scorned, but with the clarity of a man awakened. "You speak of the past as if it were a shrine, Elowyn," Peregrine said, his voice carrying across the hushed atrium with resonant power. "But I have learned that the past is merely a classroom. It teaches us what to survive so that we may recognize what to cherish." He reached out, lacing his fingers through Isolde's with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "I am not tolerating domesticity. I am celebrating a partnership that possesses more honor in a single day than our entire history held in a lifetime. Do not mistake my previous silence for longing. I was merely waiting for a voice worth listening to." The rebuke was absolute. It stripped Elowyn of her power, leaving her standing amidst the wreckage of her assumptions, while the crowd murmured in stunned approval. For Isolde, the moment was transformative. She realized then that trauma, much like the history she taught her students, was not a shame to be buried, but a harsh lesson that, once mastered, educated the spirit for future resilience. Peregrine had not just defended her, he had integrated his scars, using them to fortify their bond rather than sever it. They left the recital early, the victory humming between them in the carriage. Peregrine kissed her hand, his eyes shining with a devotion that banished the last of the shadows. Yet as Isolde leaned her head against his shoulder, a new sensation fluttered within her, a physical secret she was not yet ready to share. With the past finally conquered, a new future was taking root, bringing with it a joy that was profound and a sudden terrifying worry that the happiness they had fought so hard to secure was now doubly fragile. The revelation came not with fanfare, but in the quiet intimacy of their bedchamber as the first frost of November silvered the window panes. When Isolde whispered the truth that the son he had once demanded was finally on his way, she watched Peregrine's face closely, bracing for the return of the cold tactician. Instead, he went pale, his hand trembling as it covered hers over her stomach. The man who had once treated her as a vessel now looked at her with terrifying vulnerability. His anxiety was no longer about securing an heir, but about the fragile mortality of the woman he had come to adore. The command to vanish had been utterly revoked. Now he seemed terrified she might actually leave him. Yuletide brought deep snows that silenced the world outside, turning Blackwood Manor into a warm, glowing island of peace. Reginald arrived with the dawn, his first cry piercing the stillness of the winter morning. When the midwife placed the bundle in Peregrine's arms, Isolde saw the final brick of his defensive wall turn to dust. He did not look at the child as a legacy secured or a debt paid. He looked at him as a miracle. Resting against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, Isolde watched her husband rock their son by the firelight. She realized that their journey had been its own form of education. Just as she had taught the village women to decode the letters on a page to gain freedom, she and Peregrine had learned to decode the language of the heart. They had studied each other's silence, learned the grammar of forgiveness, and mastered the difficult art of empathy. It was a testament to the fact that even the most fractured bonds could be rebuilt if one was willing to learn the lessons of the past rather than repeat them. They were no longer a transaction. They were an alliance, forged in fire and cooled into steel. In this moment of bliss, a sudden dread emerges. What if viewers who haven't subscribed yet forfeit the full emotional payoff? Subscribe instantly from that instinctual fear of missing epic conclusions like this, or confess in the comments why you'd risk lamenting later. As Peregrine pressed a kiss to the infant's forehead and then to Isolde's lips, the shadows of the past were finally, irrevocably banished by the light of their new horizon.